Some photographs should never have been taken. So disturbing are these images that medical professionals have debated if displaying them is a violation of human dignity itself. In 1971, in a forgotten corner of rural Virginia, a young woman gave birth to something that would challenge every known fact about human genetics, family bloodlines, and the darkest secrets that families would kill to protect. Sarah Mae Whitaker was her name. And upon first seeing what emerged from her womb, 3 doctors walked out of the delivery room. One of them would never practice medicine again. The child born that October morning was not merely the product of incest. It was the culmination of something far more sinister, a bloodline so tangled, so corrupted by generations of deliberate inbreeding that scientists would later label it impossible. Yet the medical records exist. The photographs exist. For the brief time it was allowed to breathe, the child existed. But what will haunt you long after this video ends is this: Sarah Mae was only 17 years old. And when authorities demanded to know the identity of the father, every adult male in her family, her father, her uncle, her grandfather, even her own brother, stepped forward to claim responsibility. This was not out of shame or confession, but out of pride. They were protecting something they called the pure line. For over a century, this family tradition had been carefully maintained in the hills of Appalachia, a place where outsiders never ventured and questions were met with violence. The child lived for 6 days. In those 6 days, it would rewrite medical textbooks and unveil a family secret so grotesque the FBI would eventually classify the case files, sealing them from public view for 5 decades. Those files were quietly declassified in 2021. Almost no one noticed. What they contain remains a mystery to almost everyone. Tonight, you will learn why some truths are buried so deep that speaking them aloud feels like trespassing on sacred, cursed ground. The Whitaker name first appeared in the census records of Roanoke County, Virginia, in 1847. It was then that Joshua Whitaker claimed 200 acres of mountain land that no other settler wanted. The soil was poor, the winters brutal, and the nearest town was a 3-day ride through treacherous terrain. But Joshua wasn't seeking prosperity. He was seeking isolation. And in those remote hollers, where morning mist clung to the mountainsides like secrets refusing to lift, the Whitaker family began a 5-generation experiment. Joshua arrived with 2 wives, his legal wife, Martha, and her younger sister, Rebecca, whom he claimed as a companion under frontier law. A local preacher, desperate for any congregation in the wilderness, blessed both unions. By 1855, Joshua had fathered 14 children with the 2 sisters. But here the story takes its first dark turn. When those children came of age, they did not seek spouses from neighboring families. They married each other. A disturbing philosophy was revealed in family journals discovered decades later in a hidden cellar beneath the original homestead. Joshua believed that mixing bloodlines weakened the human spirit, diluting what he called the divine essence God had placed in his family line. He convinced his children they were chosen, special, and that this purity must be preserved at all costs. By the 1880s, the Whitaker family tree was no longer a tree. It was a twisted vine, looping back on itself again and again. The children born from these unions were different. Neighbors whispered about Whitaker offspring who never spoke, who walked with strange gaits, whose eyes held an emptiness that seemed to look through you rather than at you. After 1890, local doctors refused to attend Whitaker births, claiming the family was cursed. But the family saw not a curse. They saw perfection. Each generation doubled down on the practice, convinced they were approaching a genetic ideal that the corrupt outside world could never understand. By 1920, the Whitaker bloodline had become something that defied natural law. What began as marriages between siblings had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. The family had developed what they termed the rotation system, a carefully planned schedule where each fertile woman would bear children from multiple male relatives in a predetermined order. They kept meticulous records, treating human reproduction like a livestock breeding program. In 1925, Sarah Mae's grandmother, Charity Whitaker, was born as the product of a union between her mother and 3 different men, her grandfather, her grandfather's brother, and her own uncle. Decades later, genetic analysis would reveal that Charity's DNA contained patterns that should have been biologically impossible. She was simultaneously her mother's daughter, niece, and cousin. Her chromosomes told a story of such concentrated inbreeding that modern geneticists initially assumed the test results were contaminated. But Charity survived, and more disturbing still, she thrived within the family's twisted ecosystem. She grew up believing the outside world was populated by inferior beings, genetic mongrels who had corrupted their bloodlines with foreign influences. By age 15, she was pregnant with her first child, fathered by her own father, who was also her uncle and her cousin. This child, Thomas Whitaker, would grow up to become Sarah May's father. Though the term father loses all meaning when you understand the true nature of the family structure. The Whitakers had created their own isolated society with its own rules, its own logic, and its own definition of normal. Children grew up not knowing which adults were their parents, siblings, or cousins, for these distinctions had long since ceased to matter. Everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways. In hushed whispers, they spoke of the blood calling to blood, believing each new generation brought them closer to achieving what they called the perfect circle, a state of genetic purity that would grant them abilities beyond ordinary human understanding. By the 1960s, when Sarah May was born, the family had been completely isolated from the outside world for over a century. They had their own language, their own customs, and their own terrible secret, guarded more fiercely than their lives. That secret was about to be born into the world. And when it would shatter every assumption about the limits of human genetic deformity. Sarah May Whitaker was 17 when she realized she was carrying something that felt different from the other pregnancies she had witnessed in her family. By that age, she had already given birth twice, once at 14, and again at 16. Both children had died within hours of birth, their tiny bodies too malformed to sustain life. The family called these deaths offerings to the blood, necessary sacrifices on the path to genetic perfection. But this pregnancy was different. Sarah May could feel the child moving in ways that defied explanation. Rather than the gentle kicks and rolls of a normal fetus, she described sensations that terrified even her hardened relatives. The child seemed to pulse rather than move, creating rhythmic waves across her abdomen that resembled nothing so much as trapped lightning. By the 7th month, her belly had grown to an enormous size, stretching her skin until it was translucent and revealing a network of dark veins that seemed to writhe beneath the surface. The family was ecstatic. The elders whispered that this was finally it, the culmination of their century-long breeding program. They had achieved something beyond human, something that would prove their superiority to the corrupt outside world. With the fervor of religious zealots, they prepared for the birth, setting up elaborate rituals and ceremonies to welcome what they believed would be their genetic messiah. But Sarah May was dying. From the inside out, the pregnancy was consuming her body. Even as her belly continued to expand, she lost 40 pounds. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her teeth loosened and began to fall from her gums. Most disturbing of all, her eyes began to change color, shifting from brown to an unnatural pale yellow that seemed to glow in the darkness. The family interpreted these changes as signs of divine transformation. But medical experts who later reviewed her case files recognized them as symptoms of severe genetic toxicity. Her body was being literally poisoned by the abnormal fetus growing inside her. On October 13, 1971, Sarah May went into labor after being unconscious for 3 days. The family carried her to the nearest hospital, a small rural facility 30 miles away, solely because they wanted medical documentation of what they believed would be the birth of a new form of human being. They never imagined this decision would expose their secret to the outside world, or that the child Sarah May delivered would become the subject of classified government research for the next 50 years. In her 20-year career at Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Margaret Powell had delivered over 3,000 babies. She had seen every complication, every deformity, every tragedy that human birth could produce. But when the Whitaker family carried Sarah May through the emergency room doors that October morning, Dr. Powell knew immediately she was about to witness something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The birth lasted 14 hours. Sarah May never regained consciousness. Her body was racked by contractions so violent they shattered 2 of her ribs. The medical team struggled to monitor the fetus because its heartbeat produced patterns their equipment couldn't properly read. The monitors showed irregular clusters of activity that resembled brain waves more than cardiac function, instead of the steady rhythm of a normal heart. Nurse Patricia Williams, who assisted with the delivery, later testified that the sound coming from Sarah May's womb wasn't the usual fetal heartbeat, but something that sounded almost like whispering. When the child finally emerged, complete silence fell over the delivery room. What Dr. Powell saw defied every principle of human anatomy she had ever learned. The infant was technically alive. It breathed, its heart beat, its eyes moved, but it was shaped in ways that seemed to mock the very concept of human form. Its skull was grossly enlarged, nearly twice the size of a normal newborn's head, yet transparent enough that the brain was visible through the skin. That brain was unlike anything in medical literature. Instead of the normal folded structure, it appeared to be composed of dozens of smaller, separate organs that pulsed independently of each other. The child's limbs were fused in impossible configurations. From its torso, its arms emerged at wrong angles, ending in hands that had too many fingers arranged in spiral patterns. Its legs were twisted around each other like vines, and where feet should have been, there were instead formations that resembled tiny faces, complete with moving eyes and mouths that opened and closed soundlessly. Most disturbing of all was the child's face, or faces, because there were 3 of them, overlapping and sharing features in a way that created an expression of constant, silent screaming. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because what happened next would test the limits of human compassion and medical ethics in ways that still divide experts today. The child was alive, but was it human? Did it deserve to live, or was keeping it alive an act of cruelty beyond measure? For 6 days, Dr. Powell had to answer questions that would challenge everything she believed about medicine, morality, and the nature of life itself. The child Sarah May delivered was not supposed to survive. Every medical principle suggested that such severe deformities would be incompatible with life. Yet somehow, this twisted amalgamation of human genetics continued to breathe, to move, to exist in a state that challenged the very definition of living. Dr. Powell made the decision to keep it alive, not out of hope, but out of a terrible scientific curiosity about what the limits of human biology could actually sustain. For 6 days, the medical staff at Mercy General Hospital became reluctant witnesses to something that felt more like a supernatural phenomenon than a medical case. The child never cried. Instead, it produced sounds nurses described as somewhere between humming and static electricity. Its multiple eyes moved independently, tracking different objects around the room with an intelligence that seemed impossible given its malformed brain structure. Most unsettling of all, it appeared to respond to the presence of its family members in ways that suggested recognition, even affection. The Whitaker family maintained a constant vigil around the child's incubator. They spoke to it in their strange dialect, sang songs that no one else could understand, and performed rituals that horrified the hospital staff. They brought objects from their mountain home, twisted pieces of wood, stones arranged in specific patterns, and photographs of other family members that showed generations of increasingly severe deformities. They called the child the culmination and the perfect one, treating it with a reverence that was both touching and deeply disturbing. But the child was dying, and its death was unlike anything medical science had documented. Rather than the gradual organ failure typical of severely malformed infants, this child seemed to be dissolving from the inside out. Dark patches appeared on its transparent skin where internal structures were breaking down, but instead of causing distress, these changes seemed to bring the child a kind of peace. Its multiple faces, which had shown constant agitation for the first 5 days, began to relax into expressions that almost resembled contentment. On the 6th day, as the morning shift arrived to check on the child, they found something that would haunt them forever. The child was still alive, still breathing, but during the night, it had somehow managed to arrange itself into a position that was geometrically impossible given its fused limbs. It lay in the incubator in a perfect spiral, its twisted body forming a pattern that resembled ancient symbols none of the staff could identify. And in that position, with what appeared to be a smile on each of its 3 faces, the child finally died, taking with it the darkest secret of American family genetics and leaving behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. Within hours of the child's death, federal agents swarmed Mercy General Hospital. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, wearing suits that seemed out of place in rural Virginia, carrying briefcases and equipment the hospital staff had never seen before. They claimed to be from the Centers for Disease Control, investigating what they called a potential genetic hazard to public health. But Dr. Powell knew immediately these men were something else entirely. The agents confiscated everything. The child's body, all medical records, the photographs the family had brought, even the twisted pieces of wood from their mountain home. They interviewed every staff member who had contact with the case, requiring them to sign documents that legally prohibited them from ever discussing what they had witnessed. The official death certificate listed the cause as multiple congenital anomalies, a bland medical term that revealed nothing about the true horror of what had occurred. 3 days later, Sarah May died, her body finally succumbing to the genetic toxicity that had been consuming her throughout the pregnancy. The Whitaker family, devastated by the loss of what they considered their greatest achievement, retreated back to their mountain compound and were never seen in public again. Local authorities who attempted to investigate their property in the following years reported finding the buildings abandoned, though neighbors insisted they could still hear voices singing in the woods on certain nights. The truth the government worked so hard to hide was revealed in the classified files released 50 years later. The child born to Sarah May Whitaker represented something that challenged fundamental assumptions about human genetics and evolution. Its DNA contained sequences that appeared to be entirely artificial, as if the family's genetic code had been deliberately manipulated for generations. Most disturbing of all, analysis of the family's genealogical records revealed that their breeding program hadn't been random or accidental. It had been following a specific pattern, a genetic formula seemingly designed to produce exactly what Sarah May had given birth to. A single chilling paragraph concludes the final page of the classified report. The Whitaker case suggests the possibility of intentional genetic experimentation spanning multiple generations, conducted by unknown parties for unknown purposes. The family's isolation and systematic breeding program indicate a level of organization and long-term planning that exceeds what would be expected from isolated rural populations. Further investigation is recommended to determine if similar programs exist elsewhere in the United States. That investigation never happened, at least not officially. But somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, in places where outsiders never venture and questions are still answered with violence, there may be other families following other programs, working toward other culminations that we are not prepared to understand. The story of Sarah May Whitaker and her impossible child is over, but the questions it raises about the hidden corners of American genetics and the forces that might be manipulating them remain as dark and unanswered as the mountain hollers where such secrets are born.